may be seated. And for those of you who still have the Chumash open in front of you, or have the Chumash next to you, or have it open in a window online, if you want to turn back to page 1168, just because we are going to be talking about these kind of the scribal anomalies that are in this morning's Parsha, and if you want a visual, it's there for you on page 1168. That's chapter 29, verses 27 and 28. And where I'm coming from this morning, sometimes as I prepare during the week for any given Parsha, if I'm lucky, I feel like I've gotten the answers to the test. And by that I mean, I come across something and I feel a high level of confidence that someone will ask me about it. And so it's totally worth it for me to try to anticipate that question and to do the research beforehand and make sure that I'm as prepared as I can be to answer. So thank you, Joel, for making that little bit of personal prophecy come true this morning. I don't know if it would have caught anybody else's eye. But in this case specifically, what caught my eye was the back-to-back scribal anomalies in chapter 29, verses 27 and 28. And as I mentioned earlier, as you'll notice in the Hebrew, even if you don't read Hebrew, the letter lamed, which is kind of like the middle letter in that word, is even in our Chumashim, is printed unusually large and a little bit bolded. And that's in the word Vayashlichem. And in the next verse, the words Lanu Ulvanenu in verse 28 are covered with dots. And so this obviously begs the question, what is this all about? Jeffrey Tigay, in his commentary to the JPS Study Bible, gives what I think is my favorite explanation for these phenomenon. And his wording, which I'll read in a second, is why I think some people who really love Torah decide to become academics and not rabbis. Because listen to the way he kind of tells us what's going on. He writes, Tractate Sofrim requires that the lamed in this word be written large in Torah scrolls. In most places where such large letters appear, no purpose is obvious, and Midrashic commentators offer fanciful explanations. And if that's not someone telling you like it is, I've never heard that before. And with regards to the dots in verse 28, Tigay writes, ancient scribes commonly use such dots to indicate corrections, usually to delete the words thus marked. But there is nothing obviously questionable about the dotted words in this verse. So neither of those are necessarily particularly satisfying answers, but I really do love just how blunt and frank the language he uses is. So let's take for a couple minutes a closer look at some of these fanciful explanations offered by the Midrashim as to what is going on with these weird scribal traditions. Verse 27, referring to a future time and speaking in the voice of the Gentile nations, reads, and talking about the Israelites, reads, Adonai uprooted them from their soil in anger, fury, and great wrath, and cast them into another land, as is still the case. It is the Hebrew word for cast them, which has this bold letter lamed. And while I did do some digging, there actually wasn't a ton that I could find on why this single letter is enlarged. One midrash cites that the bold letter calls attention to just how long the exile will last. Another explains that the lamed is already the largest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. It being made even larger here signifies just how great the eventual fall from grace that the Israelites will experience will be. And in fact, the rabbinic understanding of this verse is that it refers to the exile and eventual disappearance of what we refer to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. One more explanation is that the scribes actually wanted to soften the harsh words of this verse, and the significance of the large lamed is to split the word vayashlichem into two words, which then becomes in Hebrew, vayesh lachem, literally, and you will have. And the rabbis indicate this, the rabbis understand this as an indication that God will always be with the people, even when they do suffer at the hands of this long and terrible exile. So that's verse 27, the large lamed. When we get to verse 28 and what's going on with the dots, it is actually even more cryptic. Again, first I want to read the whole verse. Hanistarot la'Adonai Eloheinu v'haniglot lanu ulvanenu ad olam la'asot et kol divrei haTorah hazot. Concealed acts concern Adonai our God, but with overt acts it is for us and our children forever to apply all the provisions of the teaching. The dots appear over the words for us and our children forever. But it's still, dots or no dots, it's hard to know exactly what to make of this verse. It is a mysterious verse, and it is a little bit out of place with the entire rest of the narrative of Parshat Nitzavim. What this verse is a warning about accountability and shared responsibility. On its most the most simple to understand level, it seems to say that God will keep humans accountable for what we do in secret, and our fellow humans will hold each other accountable for any wrongdoings that take place in the public eye. This time, with this particular scribal anomaly, it actually did get noticed by the rabbis of the Talmud, who explain that the dots do, in fact, as Tigay indicated, serve as a sort of erasure or weakening of the words. According to the rabbis of the Talmud, God will only hold the people accountable for their sins once they enter the land of Israel, not at this moment of the writing and not in the past. It's not a super satisfying answer. It's not necessarily any more clear than the words of the verse themselves, but because it's canonized in the Talmud, the medieval scholars actually don't have a whole lot more to say about these dots. They kind of take the Talmud's explanation as the authoritative one, and they choose to spend their precious time and brainpower on other mysterious verses. Okay, so now we've gone through the traditional explanations. And in that regard, I actually want to kind of change the claim that I started with. It's not that I sometimes get the answers to the test. Sometimes I get the questions to the test. I have an idea what people might ask. It turns out after the fact that maybe there are no answers, or perhaps at least no satisfying answers. But for me, that's not the lesson of these two passages. What I learned here is twofold: that we should find ourselves and our own context in the text, and also that it is okay, if not encouraged, to create our own fanciful explanations. With regard to the large lamed in the word vayashlichem, cast them into another land, it called attention to that word, and it led future generations of Jews to contextualize their own experience in exile. It helps us find ourselves in the text. And even beyond that, to find reassurance in this text, to remind those ancient rabbis and us in this day that God is still with us, despite the dispiriting nature of the prophecy mentioned in the Torah text and the historical circumstances of the Jewish people. When we get to the dots over the words, that's a reminder to me that we should be writing our own stories and crafting our own interpretations. As I mentioned when we read it, Parshat Nitzavim is the portion of Lo Bashamayim Hi. We're told that the Torah, the commandments, and their effects on our lives, it's not in the sky. Torah is here for us to take and make our very own. And so, sometimes we get a bonus gift, like dots over a word. And with those dots come our own interpretive options. We can choose to ignore them and say that it's an old scribal mistake and that it's just something we will never fully understand. We can choose to look up the reference in the Talmud and possibly walk away a little bit more confused, or we can choose to craft our own explanation. I'll give you mine. These words that have the dots over them, for us and our children forever, those are some of the most important words in the entire Torah. This is what's at the core of the Torah and the Deuteronomy project. So maybe the scribes wanted us to remember that, and they left us a hint. Dots. Their version of a big, bold underline. Their way of saying to all future readers that if you're going to take one thing away from this whole book of Deuteronomy, if you were spaced out for all the reading and the listening, maybe you notice the dots, and so maybe you'll take these words, that this is yours and your children's forever. We're at the end of 2 cycles right now, the Torah Moses cycle and the annual calendar cycle. It's the time of year when the Jewish community comes together over and over again over the next few weeks to declare that our tradition is valuable and how treasured the Torah is to us. There's a tremendous amount of power in that joint dedication, and the lesson from this week's Parsha and from some scribal oddities is for each and every one of us to dive in on our own as well and contribute the meaning that we can make to that powerful collective.